Hi, welcome back to my podcast, Life, the Universe, and Bowling. My name is Tom Seiler. This is the third podcast in the series, and this is about Arsenal basics. So, we talked a lot in the first two about positive access point and what a ball driller needs to know to help you. It's very important to get that point across. Now, I'm going to assume that point's been made, and we're going to talk about arsenal creation. What is an arsenal? An arsenal simply is the bowling balls or equipment that you take in the bowling center with you on any given day or night to bowl. It could include bowling balls, shoes, tape, powder, a fan. A lot of people carry fans now. It's winter in Ohio, so I don't get that one. But anyway, it could be a lot of different things. But most of the time, we're going to talk about bowling balls in your arsenal because that's what you see in the online conversations, and that's what I'm going to address here. So I don't know how many bowling balls you own. I own a lot. I've been bowling a long time. You accumulate these things. I tend to not get rid of enough of my old stuff because I tend to like to throw old stuff that I trust. But anyway, regardless of how many bowling balls you own, you can't take 8 or 10 or 25 or 40 bowling balls with you into the center on any given day to try to help you strike. So you have to make decisions about what bowling balls you take on any given night. And I'm going to help you, as in most things, make fairly simple, logical decisions out of things that can be overwhelming to decide. A lot of people take their favorite bowling balls, maybe 2 or 3 of those in a spare ball, and then they don't have room for much else, right? Maybe they take 8 balls because they can't decide what they're going to throw that night. Or last week, the lanes were a little bit different, so that spooked me. So now I'm going to take 3 balls that I ordinarily wouldn't take because I want to make sure that I'm covered in any possible situation. The reality is there's a lot of ways to build an arsenal. We'll talk about how you might do that, how you might not want to do that are common practices. And then maybe talk about what I do in my normal routine to pick what bowling balls I go to the center with. So anyway, moving forward, the focus of your arsenal is to help you strike. I don't want to take bowling balls that are not going to help me strike. Therefore, that needs to be first and foremost when you build your arsenal and you think about where you're bowling that night or day, what the lane surface is, what all the variables are that can affect the bowling environment, and how you feel might come into play. Whether you're feeling particularly strong or you've been kind of sick for a couple of weeks, just getting back to it, or maybe you worked out and did leg day and your legs are beat up or whatever. There's a lot of variables. We'll talk about some of them, but let's talk about the equipment side of the variables that most people think of when they think of building an arsenal. So the first thing that I hear most commonly is, what is the cover stock material? People say, I want to take a reactive pearl and a reactive solid and a spare ball if they're only taking 3 balls in their arsenal. Well, I can tell you personally, I've got some pearls that way out hook a lot of my solids, and I've got some solids that go straighter than some of my pearls. So assuming that a pearl is always going to be longer and a solid's going to be earlier, smoother, is not always a good assumption. Especially brand to brand, you can see some inconsistencies in that. For example, and I'm going to talk about SPI stuff because I carry a lot of SPI stuff. Very high differential ball, the Summit Ascent. It's a solid, it's a symmetric, it's a high differential core, so it flares a lot. That's got to be a hook monster, right? Nope. They put R2S solid on that, which is an older cover. It's very clean through the front. It lane shines pretty easily. So, if you've got more than 5 or 6 games on that ball, it probably looks shinier than not. And I can tell you from experience, that ball is not overly strong. It plays more like a pearl than it does a solid, for me anyway. It is a little smoother at the spot than most of my pearls, but it has very good length for a solid. It has a lot of flair. It has hook potential, although both of mine are what I would put in the medium hook range, not large hook, definitely not early. So using cover stock material as a sole determining factor is not always good. Likewise, other covers in the lineup of a particular manufacturer may show some inconsistencies similar to that. But what about cover prep? So I want a dull ball and a shiny ball, or a medium surface, or one that's really glossy, and a spare ball if I'm taking 3. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but you might have a very weak pearl that you dulled up with a low differential. It's not going to see the front much because it's a low differential ball with probably a weaker pearl cover. Making it duller, we'll see it sooner. It'll roll sooner, but it's still not going to be soon. And likewise, you can take a ball and you can shine the bejesus out of it. But if it's something like an Ion Max that has a lot of differential and a cover that's naturally very early, you're not going to see length and strength down lane like you kind of want to see later in a block as the fronts start to hook and the backs start to knot. So cover prep, cover stock material, not a great way to universally set up your arsenal. Well, what about a spare ball? What about urethane? What about shiny urethane? Nobody throws shiny urethane, but there's a variable there. What about layouts? Do they matter? Yeah, they do. Stronger or weaker? Yeah, that matters. How many balls do you take to league night? 2, 3, 4 to 6, 8 or more? Where do you fit in that grand scheme of things? So what's your goal? Your goal is to shoot high scores, right? I get it. But are you working on anything specific this week? Are you trying to learn to maybe play a little bit straighter? Has the pattern in your center been a little bit longer the last couple of weeks? So you want to maybe get more into the middle of the lane with stronger stuff that gives you a better chance to carry. I don't know. The key is there are a lot of variables, and the bigger key is that you have to know your game, and particularly what your goals are that night. What matches up for you, what works for you in this particular center may not work for everybody else. There's also an aspect of what do you not take, right? It kind of runs along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Maybe I can make good decisions about my arsenal first by knowing what the bad decisions are and avoiding them. So what do you not take? How do you double check your arsenal to make sure that you don't get trapped? Do you understand what trapped is? I walk in and the center's hooking tonight. I have more balls that help than don't. So now all of a sudden, even though I dragged 8 bowling balls into the center, 5 of them are completely and totally useless, and I probably didn't even open one of those 3-ball bags because I trapped myself into my weakest 2 balls right out of the gate. So finding out how to not trap yourself is one of the biggest first steps to building an arsenal, in my opinion. So what's my approach to it? I have lots of approaches. It depends on the center. It depends on the length of the block. If I'm bowling 3 games for league, it's not a big deal. If I'm bowling an 8-game block in a PBA regional, might be a little bit bigger deal. I might have to take more variety. I might have to take 2 transition balls instead of 1. More about that later. So my approach, I like to somewhat line up my arsenal based on how quickly the balls respond to friction. Well, how do you figure that out? Well, cover composition and layout and surface prep are all factors in this. How fast a ball responds when it sees friction is the number one factor that I pay attention to. I have the luxury of owning my own drill press, pro shop, spinner, resurfacing equipment. I can sand and shine stuff whenever I want, and I can carry whatever surfaces I want, and I can drill whatever bowling balls I want within reason. But most people don't have that luxury. It's okay if you don't. It actually may simplify your decisions. So here's my take on it. When I go into league, because I think the vast majority of the people that are listening to these podcasts are going to be average league bowlers. People look at better. My normal league arsenal is 3 bowling balls. One's quicker to respond to friction, and one's slower. The third one's a plastic ball for spares. It is that simple. That simple. It doesn't mean I have a dull one and a shiny one. Doesn't mean I have one with a 0.55 differential and one with an 0.20 differential. It means I have one that's quick to respond to friction and one that's not so quick. Usually, I'll start out with the slower one because that blends the Clift league conditions that we see that are, 6, 8, 10, 12, 20 to 1 ratios, usually in about this much space on the lane. So you need something that blends the wet and the dry a little bit so your ball doesn't get super critical at the spot. Okay. Slower response to friction is nice for less blended conditions, Clift, and higher ratios. It's right there in my notes. I just said it, but it's right there in my notes. Usually I would start with this on a house pattern. It's probably medium surface, which for me is about 3,000 or 4,000. And normally for me, it's a symmetric solid. Okay. With a moderate flare, benchmark type layout, you have to know your game. So going back to that Summit Ascent, maybe not the greatest choice for my first ball out, even though one of mine is drilled with medium, moderate flare, and it's a symmetric solid. And I keep it around 3,000, which is a moderate surface. But even so, because that solid cover has cleaner tendencies than most solid covers, it's an older cover, it sees wet dry a lot more violently than most bowling balls do. It's almost better as the quicker response to friction ball later in the block. So again, my A game ball on a house pattern is a medium surface on a medium flare ball in a symmetric solid, which essentially means that it's going to have a fairly good blending characteristic around that cliff, because we all have to throw the ball right around the cliff to score on a house shot, but not ridiculously slow or ridiculously fast or ridiculously strong or ridiculously anything. Again, symmetric solid for me, 4,000 benchmark. Might not be great for everybody, but for me, that's what works in my game. Now, I am fairly matched up. My ball speed's a little lower than most. I have the ability to manipulate the ball down lane quite a bit more than a lot of bowlers do. So I tend to go to maybe a pad or two smoother ball than most people would, just because I would rather have to trick the ball a little bit to get it to the spot, knowing that it's going to store energy and have more energy going through the pins. Because my personal game is that I hit the pocket a lot and I don't strike enough. So I leave a lot of 9 counts. My sparing percentage is good. My striking percentage is not. I'm always looking to increase my striking percentage. One of the ways that you can do that is your cover preps being a pad or so smoother, throwing 4,000 instead of 2,000. That's one way to get more energy through the pins without drastically changing the look that you have on the lane, right? So benchmark layouts, they can vary quite a bit too. Some may start with pearls. If your rev rate, speed, tilt, axis rotation, etc. match up better there. I personally don't. I will almost never start with a pearl. If I do start with a pearl, it's a slower response to friction pearl, something probably with just a pinch more surface to make it slower than it would in its native pearl form. It's definitely not going to be shiny for first ball out because that shows me the wet dry even more. but I tend to lean towards those benchmark layouts. Some may start with stronger solids to blend the wet dry more, maybe even ASIMs. Again, you have to know your game. For me personally, on a high ratio, ASIMs tend to get offline a little bit too violently. I don't want to say too quickly, but sometimes too quickly too. They just tend to be more sensitive at the spot for me than symmetrics are. So I lean toward symmetrics for high ratio patterns much more than I do ASIMs. Personally, I think most people start with way too strong of a core in their hands. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see lead bowlers make is they listen to the ball companies. The ball companies all want to sell you the biggest ball you've ever drilled. It's an ASIM core with a lot of intermediate differential. It's a solid cover or a dull factory prep pearl cover to make it earlier, smoother, a lot of flare if you use a normal layout on it, a lot of hook if you're throwing it on a high ratio pattern. I think most bowlers step into the trap of using too much ball on the fresh. My personal, again, as I've said before, choice is a symmetric solid with a moderate to smooth cover, not shiny, and a moderate flare benchmark type layout. If you always start with a benchmark type ball, you will always have a baseline of ball reaction to start with. Let me say that again because you need to understand it. If you always start with a benchmark type ball, you always have the same baseline to begin with. So you know right away whether the lanes are more or less than last week. You know right away whether you need something faster or slower in response to friction, and you can make your adjustments according to that. I don't like using asymmetric in the benchmark category simply because there's so much core torque. It can show you things that don't necessarily depict reality. So there might be a little inconsistency in the pattern or the lane surface or any of those things, and ASIMs are very quick to show you the idiosyncrasies of what's out there. Again, personally, I like symmetrics, I like mediums, I like benchmark balls to start with. Symmetrics are much more true to the pattern, in my humble opinion. Your favorite benchmarks might be the same as mine, or they might be different. For differential, I like balls that start out with a medium differential of 030 to 045. 045 is on the strong end for me for benchmarks. Again, when you look at most manufacturers and you look for a symmetric solid that's 030 to 045, that is nowhere near the top of their lineup. That's going to be a ball or two or three below the top of their lineup. That's not what they want to sell you, and that's not what they want you to throw on most conditions. And again, my medium surface prep, which is 3,000 or 4,000. I'll cover more of the details when we talk about equipment in detail later on. Layouts for me for benchmark drills are usually, and we'll talk a lot about dual angle as well, but I'm going to throw a couple of terms out here that you probably won't understand unless you're very into ball drilling. Layouts for me on the benchmark drills are usually dual angle sums around 100 degrees total and ratios that are around 1:1. So what does that mean? Dual angle starts out with a number that's a drilling angle, and then how far the pin is to the PAP, and then a number that's your angle to the VAL. The sum of those two angles, the front and back number, for me on a benchmark ball is around 100 because I'm pretty well matched up. If you're speed dominant, that number might be 60. If you're rev dominant, that number might be 130. The ratios, meaning the first number ratio to the second number, is around 1:1. So if I want an angle sum of 100, I'm not going to do 100 degrees by 5 inches by 0. I'm going to do something that looks around 55 or 50 by 4 inches by 55 or 40. So those numbers, ratio of 1:1, matter a lot. Benchmark balls have a ratio of around 1:1. Control balls have a ratio of around 1:2, meaning that the drilling angle is going to be about half of the angle to the VAL. That puts the pin below the fingers, makes it a low pin drill. Those are control balls. They're not early hooking balls. Low pins don't hook earlier. That is a misconception that is said over and over and over again on the internet. Hear me clearly. Low pin balls don't hook earlier. They see friction smoother. When they respond, they actually hook a little later for better bowlers. For everybody, actually, but better bowlers notice that. Don't fall into the misconceptions. Angular bowling balls, where the sum still around 100, benchmark is around 1:1 ratio. An angular bowling ball may be 2:1 instead of 1:2. So a control ball for me would be 30 by 3 by 60. An angular ball for me might be 60 by 5 by 30. So you flip those numbers around, the 30 and 60 around. And again, benchmarks 45 by 4.5 by 45. That one's an easy one to remember because it's 45, 4.5, 45. Dual angle sum is 90. That's pretty benchmarky. It's about in the middle for most people. It's not too much. It's not too little. So if you're matched up speed and rev rate, it's a good place to start. 4.5 inches pin to PAP. It's a good place to start. It's not going to be super early and controlly. It's not going to be overly strong. It's not going to be super late and jerky. Medium. Again, we'll cover a lot more stuff in dual angle later. But for me, benchmark balls are going to be a dual angle sum of around 100 degrees total. A ratio of around 1:1. So same drilling angle and angle to the VAL. We will cover dual angle drilling in excruciating detail in future podcasts. Trust me on this, because I feel it's critically important for bowlers to understand how their equipment is either helping them or hindering them in making shots. Even if you don't understand the specific degrees of the layout, if you understand the ratios and the overall sums of the drilling angle, you're going to understand really quickly whether that ball is going to be early in controlling the back end, later in accentuating the back end, or something benchmarky that's kind of good on all conditions. So that's my league arsenal. One ball that's slower in response to friction, one ball that's faster in response to friction, and a spare ball. When do you use which? Well, when they're fresh, you have wet in the front, dry in the back, wet in the middle, dry to the right or left. Then you're probably going to use your slower response ball until the front starts to hook a little bit because oil gets picked up, and the back starts to not hook as much because most bowling balls do move a little bit of oil down the lane based on their flare, not their cover composition. So as the day goes on and you have to move away from that early hook primarily, but you still need a ball to come around the corner, maybe a little harder, because now as you move left or right if you're left-handed, to get away from that early hook that you created by taking the oil off the lane, now you need the ball to recover more boards on the back, so you might need something that sees the lane a little bit quicker down lane so you don't leave flat tens. Those slow rolly balls can really start to ping on you when the lanes transition. So generally speaking, you're going to throw a slower ball first and then move into your longer, quicker balls, quicker in response to friction later on. For tournament arsenals, and again, this is for more of a tournament bowling crowd, I'll typically carry more equipment than 3, but I start with the same 3. So tournaments often don't use high ratio patterns, so it's important to find out what pattern length and ratio are before you go to the tournament, if it's an advertised pattern. And also how much friction is built into the lane surface. This might mean knowing what type of surface it is, how many years ago it was installed and worn. Knowing this can help you narrow down what gear to bring. If you don't know this, don't panic, just bring a variety. It's that simple. Adding to my 3-ball arsenal for tournaments, I'll add 2 more balls first. And guess what? One of them is going to have faster response to friction, and one of them slower. but I'm going to tweak something here. Both of those balls will either have more or less cover than my benchmark or my first slow and fast ball in response to friction. I.e., if I think the surface will hook more than normal, these two balls will both be a pad or two smoother than my benchmarks. Okay. Consequently, if I think the surface is slicker or newer than normal, or there's going to be a higher volume or length of oil, then I'll select balls with a pad or two more surface than normal. Again, I'm not altering my first three, but I'm altering what options I have beyond those first three. If you're not familiar with the term a pad or two more, all that means is if you normally throw a ball with 2,000, a pad more would be 1,000. A pad less would be 2,000 or 3,000, right? So a smoother ball or a duller ball slightly to give you maybe about a zone's worth of difference in how they see the lane. Maybe a little less than a zone on some conditions, but either way. Having the cover prepped a little too dull or a little too smooth doesn't make a ball unusable. It just determines your starting position and what zone you have to play and how the ball goes through the pins. All those things are very important, but it doesn't make the ball unusable. What it does do, if you happen to get lucky and find the right surfaces, is it makes that bowling ball usable for a longer period of time, so you don't have to go back to the bag and fetch the next ball quite so frequently. You can stay in that ball for a longer period of time. Once you have your base 3 balls plus the 2 more that give you more or less surface prep, you may choose to carry a gap ball or 2. Gap balls are specialized layouts, surface prep, etc. that work on specific conditions but may not be great for general bowling on normal conditions, high ratios. Example of this might be short pins for control, urethane, abnormal surface prep, super shiny or super dull, or whatever you feel you need to cover conditions that may not be handled by your 3 or 5 base bowling balls. For me, gap balls are usually a short pin asymmetric with some surface, ultimate control. By the way, short pins means a pin has a short distance from the PAP to the axis. Usually this is a 1 to 3 inch drill. These are not common drills unless you're a tournament bowler. These balls provide early flare and can look like big urethane balls on some conditions. They can. Or maybe they bridge the gap between urethane and reactives. Other gap balls for me would be an extremely low diff, low pin, super shiny symmetric to use if the friction builds up early. I've bowled 8-game blocks a few times in tournaments where I had to throw that ball, that gap ball, that really weak gap ball, for 4 or 5 or 6 games in that block because of extremely worn track area, creating a hook that normally doesn't exist in the pattern itself. More on that when we talk about patterns. Over time, you learn what works well and what doesn't, and you'll also learn your own bowling style. I prefer to not have too many choices in equipment because it allows me to search for the perfect reaction rather than adjusting speed or hand position to dial into what I have already. Too many options is a bad thing for a technical mind like mine. I want to find the perfect reaction, and perfect gets in the way of good enough quite a bit for me. I rarely walk into league with more than 3 balls, and I almost never take more than 7 or 8, even to a PBA regional, on a surface that's unknown to me, in a strange center that's unknown to me. Too many choices simply overwhelm me. I'm a capable bowler with several release styles, and I can vary my ball speed a little, and my rev rate a little, maybe a reasonable amount. And I work better when I can make equipment choices simple and adjust my game to fine-tune to the conditions. Maybe you're different. Maybe you want to slot in that perfect ball. For me, I would rather tweak it a little. So I keep my equipment choices pretty simple. Since we talk about arsenal creation, let's talk about what not to do with your arsenal. Pay attention to your surfaces, but never ever change all of your surfaces at one time. Because when you change your surfaces, even putting that same 2000 grit on a ball that came out of the box with, your reaction will change somewhat. Lane shine happens. You want your benchmark balls to be consistent, familiar, and comfortable. Comfortable. Keyword. If you need to change some surfaces on your 4th or 5th ball or gap ball, no big deal, but always keep your benchmark as consistent as possible. Don't take too many balls that are too different. I tend to drill 2 layouts for about 80% of my bowling balls. I used to make fun of this, but I don't make fun of it anymore, because adjusting surfaces and drilling different base bowling balls with core strengths and stuff that are different tends to make them look differently. And again, I said I used 2 layouts. One of those, not surprisingly, is a quicker response to friction. One of those is a slower response to friction for about 80% of my bowling balls, 20% are gap balls. If you're changing core and cover and layout and surface prep, every time you switch balls, you'll see very different reactions on the lane, which can be very confusing. So don't do it. Keep it simple, right? When you change balls, it's very easy to change from a low RG, solid 4,000 grit, 45 by 5 by 45 benchmark ball to a medium RG symmetric pearl with some polish and a 45 by 5 by 45 layout. Difference is there because I went quickly. I went from a solid to a pearl, but I had the same layout and a similar cover preparation. Maybe the pearl is a little shinier, maybe not. But the key is they retain the same general shape. You get a little bit more energy retention, so maybe a little more pop down lane, easier through the front, etc. But you aren't relearning the shape of the ball, and you're not likely jumping 2 zones to be able to throw it. Your first shot's not going to be a bucket or a 2-4-8-10 or a dog leg. It's probably going to be a flat 10 if you don't strike, or a 4-pin if you don't strike. So it makes the transitions easier, even though there's a difference between the ball. It's not a completely different shape. Be sensible with your equipment, and the game gets way less confusing. One final thought, and I know, again, I'm tending to run long on these, is that I like to pair stronger and weaker balls that have the same shape on the lane. Actually, most of my arsenal is set up in pairs like this. Those pairs may have the same layout, are likely from the same manufacturer, and have surface preps that are slightly different, along with taller or shorter cores that give me more coverage across a bigger variety of lane conditions. Taller core means a higher RG starting. Shorter core means a lower RG starting. So they spin up faster. Many times when I take 5 into the center for a tournament, it's a spare ball and then 2 pairs of balls that are matched with each other. So a quicker and a slower response to friction in one pair, a quicker and a slower response to friction in another pair, and a spare ball. Those 5 can get me through just about anything. And if I add a gap ball or 2, it makes a great multi-purpose arsenal. Consistent. Don't carry 8 different bowling balls than you carried to the last tournament. I'm guilty of this myself sometimes because new stuff comes out. Keep your base 3 as close to the same as you can. Change those next 2 when it makes sense. Make your changes in your gap balls in the top end of your arsenal, not in the base. Final words, always start with spare ball. Always, 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 always. Always take quicker and slower response balls. Understand which is which. And if you carry more than 3, you carry a wider variety of surface preps. Gap balls should be treated exactly as such. Special use balls for use on very short or very long patterns, very low or very high friction, not on general purpose bowling. So those are the basics of arsenal creation. I hope this video/podcast is helpful to you. If it is, do the like and subscribe thing. I'm not going to preach that on every video. But again, my name is Tom Seiler. The podcast is Life and Universe in Bowling, and I hope you enjoyed it.